Good morning and welcome to another installment, another episode here of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Good to have you here on a very gray day. I hear the sun might come out later today. There's rumors. And welcome to folks who are live streaming us or watching later on video. Today is the book of Daniel. And so if you've been coming periodically, we've been working our way through the Older Testament. We started off walking through history in the fall, from creation to the destruction of kingdoms, and since then we've been hopping around a little more randomly. But today we're going to settle into the book of Daniel, and I'll get us situated in terms of what's going on in this book and where it comes from. But first, of course, always announcements. We have what I think is a fantastic video this week. If anybody has seen it already, if not, I highly recommend a 32-minute interview that Margaret and I conducted with Anathea Portier-Young, who's an Old Testament scholar at Duke Divinity School and is literally one of the leading global scholars on the book of Daniel, and it's, I think, a really good conversation. So if you don't get enough today of Daniel, watch that on your own time. Adult Education webpage, go to the Westminster webpage, click on Grow Adult Education, and you'll find your way to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny. If you want to discuss Daniel further, on Wednesday, Margaret will be hosting in the Meisel Room or also online on Zoom. The Adult Ed E-Blast has the link. If you don't know what in the world an Adult Ed E-Blast is, see me afterwards that we can get you signed up just to get one email a week about adult education information. And then finally, Church in the Round is starting in just a couple of weeks. What is Church in the Round? This is something we do during the Lenten season. So Lent begins on Ash Wednesday, the 14th of February. You can't spell Valentine without L-E-N-T. So Sunday the 18th is the first of 5 Sundays when we will not have our usual The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, but we'll spend, as a church, the season of Lent studying the book of Psalms, these 150 poems, psalms, prayers in the middle of the Bible. And there are opportunities to study the Psalms in smaller groups. So groups of about 8, probably no more than 10 people. Margaret and I have written a curriculum on this. We've got all sorts of exercises that you might do during the week to go deeper into Psalms if you want to, but if you just want to meet once a week for an hour with a small group, those will be Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights, and Wednesday noon. Is that correct, Margaret?
Yes. Wednesday, like 12:30 right after.
12:30, not really noon, but soon after. There are little purple cards on your table. You can use those if you want to sign up. The easiest thing to do is to scan it with your phone, and if you have a Realm account, it will take you there, and you can sign up digitally. If that sounds terrifying to you, just fill it out, and you can leave it on the table, or you can hand the card to me or to Margaret. There'll also be a table by the stairs. Cindy Vakis will be at that table between the services. If you want to sign up in person, do it the old-fashioned way. That's also just fine. Or if you have questions, again, see me, see Margaret. But that's coming up, and signups are now open. What do you want to add about that, Margaret? Does that sound about right?
That's great.
Okay, it's going to be great. We're really excited about it. A chance to not spend Lent not being talked at, like what's going to happen today, but to settle down in smaller groups and dig into the Psalms. All right, today with Daniel, are you ready for a very different kind of book and a very different kind of outlook? If you've been suffering through a whole lot of Sundays of judgment and people saying, why didn't you do better? And kind of a blaming of the victim almost kind of a mentality in some of these books, maybe the book of Daniel is for you. It's different in a host of ways. First of all, the genre, the kind of literature this is quite different. We've got some thrilling tales, some kind of folktale style stories in the book of Daniel, and we've also got wild apocalyptic visions as well. If you've read the book of Revelation in the New Testament, Daniel was that book's inspiration in one way, or they're connected in that regard. You really have to understand Daniel, I think, or I should say this: understanding Daniel helps you understand the Newer Testament better. because some of the theology in Daniel, some of the ways of communicating in Daniel show up as well in the Newer Testament. That's just a teaser for next time I talk about the New Testament in front of you. Second, this is from the book of Daniel comes from a very different time and place in history than what we've looked at so far. More on that in just a minute. The book of Daniel also has a vision or a promise about resurrection, about post-mortem existence. It's the fancy term for that, life after death. We've not seen that in other Older Testament writings. It's in Daniel chapter 12. It's also a book that's full of encouragement. That's maybe one of the underlying themes of this book. Previously, in the Older Testament, we've seen a lot of promises of judgment. We've seen a lot of accusations or indictments being leveled against people, saying the reason all of this hardship is coming is because you have not been faithful. Here in Daniel, we're going to see much more of a mood or a theme in which the author is saying to people of faith, all the horrible things that are happening to you, I see them. I know about them. They're happening to you not because you've made mistakes, but because you're being so faithful. In other words, it's a book written to people enduring religious persecution or violence that they are suffering in response to their own particular religious practice as a religious minority in a larger culture. We'll unpack that some more in just a little bit. It's a bit of a raucous ride, but it's also a book that's very frank about the reality of evil in the world and the monstrosity of evil in the world as well. So we're going to see that. Okay, that's kind of our brief introduction. Here's a question Margaret loves to ask, and I'm going to steal it. Are there any stories or details that you can recall from the book of Daniel? If you've read it before, recently, long time ago, what do you associate with the book of Daniel? For this, you can just shout it out, and I'll repeat it for people online. And Daniel in the lion's den. Is that the same? The firing of the fiery furnace, the writing on the wall. You probably all used that expression at some point in time. This is where it comes from. Fiery furnace, Daniel in the lion's den, writing on the wall. Anybody have any others? Those are the big ones. There's a dream. Nebuchadnezzar, a king, has a dream that has to be interpreted. There's actually a couple of scenes of interpretation, of dream interpretation. Vegetarianism gets a big shout out in Daniel chapter 1. More on that soon. Anything else? This is good. See, people, we know things. Probably the most popular, I think, would be the story of Daniel in the lion's den and the story of the fiery furnace. If that doesn't make any connections in your mind, don't worry, we'll get to those. But here's my next question. Those are, again, probably the two most popular stories. They're also stories that a lot of churches like to teach to children. And so here's this lovely, what's that? It's a 3D craft kit. Yeah, you can buy this and cut out the pieces and put them in there. I found another one too, which is, the image online was not great, but it has a little stick, and you push the stick up and the flames get higher and higher around the three men in the furnace, and there's also a fourth figure in the background there. This is really a serious question. Why do we teach these stories to children, if you know the stories? They're both potentially violent stories. They're both about people of faith who survive what looks like a tremendous threat of violence and come out unscathed. Any thoughts? God protects us is not a bad message in a scary world. Oh, we could be used as fear to control our behavior. That's the other side of it, right? You better shape up. They're standalone stories. You don't have to know anything else about Daniel. The three men in the fiery furnace are named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is just fun to say, let's admit it. You don't need to know who they are. Yeah, you're all saying it in your head. Any other thoughts about why we trust in God? There's stories of people who look like they're doomed, and somehow, against all odds, God protects them.
It's kind of a plug for martyrdom.
It's a plug for martyrdom. And we want to teach that to children because maybe we do. I just think Christian faith has a lot of, and the Bible in general has a lot of violence in it. I don't want to spoil anything, but Jesus is not treated well in his story. And I think of all of the children's literature I read to my children when they were growing up, which have a lot of mature themes in the sense of about violent, these post-apocalyptic stories. Right now, I remember reading The Hunger Games with my kids and thinking, this is really heavy, and children can talk about death. Grimm's fairy tales. I mean, there's a way in which these types of stories, the violence in these stories, for some children, obviously not for all, feels a little bit distant and a little bit mysterious. So these are stories that have this larger-than-life quality about them, but they're also deadly serious at the same time. And we know this is true, I think, as adults. There's certain stories you can laugh at, but also we recognize just how grave the consequences of a story might be and how grave the issues might be. Sometimes we use humor to laugh in the face of threat, right? To try to rebalance us or to avoid going down too far down a road of worry or concern. Maybe that's part of the appeal of a book like Daniel. So I promised I would set us in history. If you've come before, you might have seen this slide or a version of it, which really is something I think I invented in my head on a Saturday night and has now, I'm going to try to trademark this or something. This is basically a history of the nation or nations in the Older Testament from the establishment of the kingdom, Saul on the far left. And then we've talked about exile in the pink there. Margaret talked about Ezekiel, which is set in the context of that exile. And we never really have taken it into the future on the right side there. But what I want to do today is go there, right? What happens beyond? What happens when we go further forward in time? So get ready. There's no good way for me to animate this because I don't have those kinds of skills, but we're going to shrink this timeline down. Ooh. And so we can build on it, right? And move into the future. Isn't that exciting? So let's extend that green line a little bit further. We're going into the future. Left is the past, right is moving forward. Into what's called Second Temple Judaism. Why is it called Second Temple Judaism? The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians around the year 586 before the Common Era. The temple gets rebuilt after the exile, where it says Cyrus of Persia allows forcibly deported Judeans to return. Margaret will take us into that period next week, so we're jumping around a little bit in time. Second Temple Judaism is the Judaism into which Jesus is born. Right? Jesus is arrested after spending several days teaching in the temple. He goes to the temple in the Gospels. It's the temple that was rebuilt after the exile. And it takes a while to get there. So some things happen between the construction of that second temple in the early 6th century prior to Jesus. One thing that happens is the Greeks arrive. They would say we're Macedonians, but they're speaking Greek and they have Greek culture. These are the conquests of Alexander the Great, who you might have heard of, one of the greatest military commanders ever in terms of his victories and the amount of land he was able to conquer and control. He comes into that area, Israel, around 332 before the Common Era. This is why the New Testament's written in Greek. This is why so many people in the New Testament have Greek names. Right? Alexander spreads Greek culture wherever he goes. After Alexander dies, there's a struggle for control over his empire. And again, we're talking about the history now of Israel, this small strip of land. It becomes ruled by some of Alexander's advisors from Egypt, known as the Ptolemies, around the year 300. They're pretty hands-off. They say, you can be Jewish, you can live however you want, we don't really care, just make sure the taxes keep flowing and everybody's happy. Around the year 200, a group of, again, people descended from Alexander, the Seleucids, also sometimes pronounced Seleucids, take your pick, potato, potato. The Seleucids, who are based in Syria and Mesopotamia, seize control. And for a while, again, it's just about the same. Taxes are flowing in a different direction now, but by and large, if you're Jewish and living in that part of the world, you're pretty much left alone until the rise of a ruler, who we'll get to in just a minute. Later on, in the year 63, before the Common Era, the Romans take over the land. Of course, the Romans are occupying it when Jesus is born. That's as far forward as I think I'll take you, at least today. But so you can get a sense of what's going on. You get the idea of empire after empire after empire is controlling this land. In the midst of that, you might have heard of the Maccabean Revolt. This is a revolt that takes place among Jews in the years 167 to 164. This is where the origins of Hanukkah reside, when the temple is rededicated. Why a Maccabean revolt? Because there's a ruler, a Seleucid ruler, who takes control, who causes just a tremendous amount of chaos. And his name, that's what I want to look at right now, because this will help us with Daniel, the era of the Seleucids and the era of the Maccabean revolt. But this ruler who comes to town is a man named Antiochus IV. Just to get a sense of just kind of how powerful this empire is, this is the amount of land that Alexander the Great is able to conquer and control. You see maybe Greece there in toward the left, Macedonia in the northern part, about half of the coast of the Black Sea, all the way down to the Nile Valley in Egypt, Judea, all the way as far as what's modern-day India. So just a tremendous amount of geography comes under Alexander's control. When he dies, this largely gets divided up, and this empire that comes around, different map, slightly different scale, the Seleucids, or the Seleucids, around the year 200, also control a tremendous amount of land. You can see they're barely into Israel, or what then we would call Judea. You can see Mesopotamia, the two rivers there, modern-day Iraq, as well as quite a bit of land to the east. So they control a lot of land. They control a lot of important seaports. They control a lot of arable land, places that's good for farming. A relatively wealthy and powerful empire, but also a really brutal empire. And that's seen when Antiochus IV comes along. Antiochus IV takes the name for himself, the nickname Epiphanes or Epiphanes. What season is this in the church calendar right now? Epiphany. Epiphany means manifestation, a manifestation of a deity. This is how does Jesus become manifest to the world? Epiphanes, he takes on this name because Antiochus says he is a God made manifest to the world. Right? He himself is not just a king, he's also a deity. If you're guessing that probably doesn't play too well for a Jewish crowd, you're right. There's one God and one God only. Antiochus's way of ruling was what we might call heavy-handed. He appropriated money from the temple treasury in Jerusalem for building projects. He issued an edict that forbade groups from practicing their own religious customs. In other words, if you're Jewish, no more sacrifice in the temple, no circumcising your sons, no honoring the Sabbath day. He basically makes it illegal to be Jewish. So significant religious persecution. He kills many people in Jerusalem and destroys homes there when he's trying to subdue uprisings in Jerusalem. Finally, at one point, what he does is he goes into the Jerusalem temple with a pig, sacrifices the pig on the altar in the Jerusalem temple in a ceremony to the Greek god Dionysus. So this is Antiochus's way of subduing his people. What happens after that, this revolt breaks out, the Maccabean revolt, which eventually drives the Seleucids out, and Judea is able to rule itself for a while. But that Maccabean revolt is not just a war of Jews against Seleucids, it's also a Jewish civil war. In other words, there were plenty of Jews who thought, I guess this is a way forward, right? There's a lot of wealth coming into our land with the Seleucids. Maybe we can find a different way. And so the war is pitting Jews against Jews as well as Jews against Seleucids. Does that make sense? I mean, you can get a sense of now this is starting to get really ugly in a hurry. So it's a horrific time. This is a time of religious persecution. This is the first, I guess, period that we know of that we can validate from other sources where Jews are persecuted, and by that I mean killed, tortured, punished, simply for the fact of being Jewish and for practicing their Judaism. right? This is Antiochus's way, again, of subduing them, is to basically kind of wipe out their sense of religious identity. We know of other stories about this time from the books of First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, which are in Roman Catholic Bibles and Eastern Orthodox Bibles. You could read some of those stories, just some horrific stories about torture and punishment that are taking place. So this is what's going on during the year 167 to 164. There's another, we know a lot about Antiochus from other sources, things like coins as well. So to go back to our timeline, the book of Daniel then, we believe is compiled, is finally put together, reaches its final form sometime during that Maccabean revolt. In other words, it's a book that's prepared and written to people who are enduring a tremendous amount of persecution for the sake of their being Jewish. The stories in Daniel and that name Daniel recall somebody who's mentioned in a couple of sources that we really know nothing about, who lived during the time of the exile in the Babylonian Empire. So the book of Daniel, although it's written in the 2nd century, in the 100s before the Common Era, it's written then, it's pulling on old stories about things that happened during the Babylonian exile. Does that make sense? So we've kind of got this bifocal view taking place here. And so the first half of Daniel are stories, are these folk tales about a man named Daniel and some of his friends. And they're set in the time of the exile. They're set during the time of the Babylonian exile, and they also start to bleed into when the Persians start to take over. So what appears to have happened is somebody has taken, or communities have taken old folk tales, right, about a hero of the Babylonian exile, about a Jew who was able to live faithfully during the Babylonian exile, and they're now recasting those stories to give encouragement to people suffering persecution in the age of Antiochus Epiphanes. Let me pause there. Does that make sense? The history lesson will end here for the most part. So, one question, yes?
So they relied on something that happened 460 years ago?
So the book of Daniel is writing about a figure from about 400 years prior. How did they know that? Ezekiel has a brief mention to somebody named Daniel. That appears there might have been some other folk tales about a person named Daniel who was upstanding among the exiles in Babylon, who just proved to be faithful. And then stories got attached to that person. It could have been a telephone game. It could have been that these, I'll talk about the folk tales in a minute. It could be that these are just popular tales that eventually started to take on more and more kind of connection around this figure named Daniel, who's this kind of idealized exile, who's smarter than everybody else, who's more faithful than anybody else, who's celebrated more than anybody else. All right? Okay. What's in the book of Daniel? 30 seconds. First half. Dramatic court tales about survival, wisdom, and faithfulness. These are 6 great chapters, rollicking stories. These are the stories everybody was talking about earlier. Great stuff, fun to read, larger than life. Read them to your children. Interesting that Daniel, most of this part of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, which is a kind of a derivation of Hebrew, same family of languages that starts to become spoken more broadly around the time of the Seleucids. Second half of Daniel, how's my time? Are Daniel having these wild visions, right? God is showing him these visions of beasts. Daniel's in communication with angels. Daniel is being given information about the end of the world and about the punishment of the unrighteous. Very different, right? This is the part that reads a lot like parts of the book of Revelation in the New Testament. How'd I do? That's the book of Daniel, right there in 30 seconds. It's this dramatic shift of folklore mixed with then these other, in some ways, kind of scary stories, these mysterious stories as well. There's a little asterisk there by chapter 12. Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles actually contain 2 additional chapters to Daniel. No time to talk about those, but also great stories in those as well. What's going on in the first half can be described as a kind of literary trope, a literary motif. And the best way to describe that is to borrow from a book title, The Jew in the Court of a Foreign King. This is a dissertation written by somebody named Lawrence Wills back in 1990. So that expression, the Jew in the Court of the Foreign King, is the name of his book, and has also became kind of a way of describing this literary trope. We saw a bit of this at the end of the book of Genesis. Remember way back in October when Margaret taught on Joseph? Joseph goes to Egypt. How does he get himself out of trouble? He can interpret dreams. And he's also a really good administrator. And so the Pharaoh puts him in charge over all sorts of things. He's a Jew. He's away from home, but he's able to rise in stature and importance in the land of this foreign king. Also, the book of Esther, which we'll look at in 2 weeks from today. That'll be also interesting, Daniel 1 through 6. There are also some non-biblical Jewish writings that have this same trope of a Jew in the court of a foreign king who's able to do amazing things. What do? It's usually somebody of low stature who can accomplish something nobody else is able to do. Joseph can interpret dreams that nobody else can interpret. Usually in these stories, the king's courtiers, these other administrative officials, threaten the Jewish protagonist. They find ways to undermine him and try to get him destroyed. And often the king in these stories is incredibly violent, excessively vain, and just comically stupid. They're just cartoon characters in so many ways. So we talked about the writing on the wall. This image here is from Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar is a Babylonian king who throws a party for 1,000 of his lords. All of his wives are there. All of his concubines are there. He's had too much to drink. And so he says, hey, let's get all the golden stuff that we took from the Jerusalem temple when we sacked Jerusalem, and let's drink wine out of it, and let's have some ceremonies to our Babylonian gods. And so they're having this party, and suddenly a hand appears and starts writing on the wall. And nobody can decipher what's written on the wall. And somebody says, hey, there was this guy Daniel who was really smart. Maybe he knows. And so Daniel comes in and he says, I got bad news for you. This means your kingdom's going to be taken away from you. And that very night, Belshazzar is killed. So it's the kind of a story, right? Nobody else can figure out what's going on. The king's an idiot. The king has no self-control. And the king becomes, kind of this morality tale of his own downfall. That's what we see over and over again in Daniel 1 through 6. So let's expand it a little bit and give ourselves 5 minutes now to walk through the book of Daniel. How about that? Daniel starts off chapter 1. We hear about Daniel and 3 of his friends who are Hebrew youths who are chosen by the king of Babylon to kind of be trained in Babylonian language and literature and law, and hopefully the best of the best will rise and will become useful and will serve the Babylonian system. Daniel and his friends refuse to eat the king's rations. They're like, we don't want all the meat. We just don't know where this meat comes from. It's going to violate our dietary laws. And so the king's official who's in charge of feeding all of these deported, enslaved people says, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my head if the king does roll call and you look really scrawny. And Daniel says, give us 10 days of only water and vegetables, and let's see what happens. After 10 days later, Daniel and his 3 friends all are like the biggest and strongest and like look the best, right? So here's the vegetarianism plug. And everybody's amazed. And so they're able to outdo everybody else, even on this strict vegetarian diet. And they rise in the court. They get more and more responsibility. Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has a dream, and nobody can interpret it. Nobody knows what it's about. And because he won't tell them, he's had this disturbing dream, and all of his wise men say, well, tell us what the dream is and we'll interpret it. And he's like, nope, I want you to tell me what the dream was, and then I want you to interpret it. And they're like, well, we can't do that. So he orders all of the wise men to be killed. Again, all these kings are just incredibly rash. Daniel finds out about it, and he finds the guy, the official who's responsible to execute all the wise men. He's like, don't execute the wise men. Like, I got this. Don't worry about it. And he's like, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't execute the wise men. Daniel's like, I got this. So Daniel goes to the king. Daniel tells him what the dream was. Daniel interprets the dream to him. It's about the statue that's destroyed. The statue is Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's got every little detail worked out. Everybody survives. The king praises Daniel, praises his God, and Daniel keeps rising in stature, right? He's working his way up in the administrative system. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue and says everybody has to worship this statue. Daniel's friends refuse to do that. They're thrown into a fiery furnace. End of the story. They survive. We'll come back to that in a minute. Chapter 4, there's another dream for Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel says, this is bad because since you're such an evil king, since you're so violent, since you're so proud, you're going to go mad temporarily. And sure enough, guess what happens? Nebuchadnezzar becomes mad. Always a good time to show a William Blake painting. William Blake was a lovely tormented mystic and painter himself. Nebuchadnezzar is driven out into the wild and lives like an animal. We don't know how long he's like this. It says until his hair, I think, is as long as a beast, and his fingernails are as long as an eagle's claw. So and then Nebuchadnezzar comes back to his right mind and says, "All praise the God of Daniel." And you think, this is finally going to change something, isn't it? No, because there's a new king in chapter 5, who's King Belshazzar. I talked about this, who sees the writing on the wall during the banquet for 1,000 of his lords. Chapter 6, a new king. This is now King Darius. He has advisors who are very jealous of Daniel. They say, this guy has got way too much responsibility. Let's get the king to pass a law. Let's tell the king he has to pass a law where nobody can pray to any god except for the king himself. And anybody who is caught praying to a different god, we're going to throw into the den of lions. And let's make sure this law is according to the fashion of the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which can never be revoked. And you're thinking, what in the world is going on here? Who are the Medes? Who are the Persians? What is a law according to the Medes and the Persians? We know of no such law. It's a little bit crazy, right? That who would make a law that can never be revoked? There are some lawyers in the room. Maybe this has been done before, but it just sounds like the thing a totally rash king would do. And then, of course, Daniel prays by his open window to his God. Everybody's like, look, he's praying. And the king is heartbroken because he loves Daniel. And he's like, I wish I could change this, but I made this law according to the Medes and the Persians, right? And so it's this king who paints himself into his own corner and can't get out of it. Throws Daniel into the den of lions, and guess what happens? He survives. Then we get these other parts, these apocalyptic visions. There's a vision of 4 beasts. We'll come back to that. There's a vision of a ram and a goat. Daniel prays, receives a message from the angel Gabriel. We get a vision of the future, which has references to all of these great kingdoms, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, Antiochus Epiphanes as well. And then in chapter 12, a promise of resurrection. I'm going to give these chapters short shrift today. Not because they aren't important, but because the folk tales are so much more fun. But we will come back to chapter 7. Some of you I recognize might have come from, maybe you still are, in churches where these chapters are very important for people who want to predict the future. I'm not recommending that. I'm just saying that, get on your phone and type Daniel End of the World, and you'll get taken to some really, really interesting websites of people who have figured out, which of these horns is Belgium, and where's the European Union, and where's the Ukraine? I mean, people who make a cottage industry out of predicting the end of the world. I don't recommend that. We can come back to that in a future week if you'd like to. All right, so that's the book of Daniel. Is that 5 minutes? Whew, good. So I want to zero in on 3 of those stories just to illustrate more of what's going on here. And one of those is Daniel in the lion's den, which I summarized. And also a great way is to show some art. I love this one. I mean, Daniel's portrayed as young in many of these stories. Here you have a mature Daniel who's just utterly relaxed in this den of lions, which I love. There's a sense of his wisdom and his satisfaction or his confidence compared to Reuben's, who's got a younger Daniel who looks a little terrified in this situation. And those lions look a little hungrier to me as well. So it's inspired some really tremendous art. We have this in the Meisel room, or at least a print of this, as well from John August Swanson with great color. You see the king there who's very worried about Daniel and that Daniel's not going to survive. I want to zero in on, I've kind of talked about how the reason Daniel gets into trouble is because other advisors are conspiring against him. They say, let's get rid of Daniel. We can do it if we make his religion illegal. And if he's caught praying, he's going to get tossed into the lion's den, and the king can't do anything about it. And the king, again, is too stupid to be able to realize that he can't do anything about it. And the king also has this soft spot in his heart for Daniel for strange reasons. Toward the end of this story, it says this: they come back the next morning and Daniel is still alive. The king's outside the door yelling, "Daniel, did your God save you?" And Daniel's like, "Yes." And the king was exceedingly glad and demanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Again, who are these stories written for? Right? People undergoing persecution, people who are suffering not because it's their fault. And so the story is encouraging trust. The king gave a command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Again, these kings have no self-control, right? So after experiencing this, right, the king is so prone to violence, and now he's like, well, we're going to punish all these conspirators, and they're going to get wiped out. Also, what's the detail? What does that detail do for us? The fact that all of these people are destroyed by the lions? It's not that the lions weren't hungry when Daniel was in there, right? They were starving. They were ready to maul anybody, but something about Daniel's protection. It takes away an excuse that Daniel's survival was because of something like, the lions were sleepy, or they didn't think Daniel tasted good, or who knows. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language. See the hyperbole here, right? He goes, I'm going to write a letter to everybody in the whole world. I want every language here. May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in my royal dominion people shall tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For this God is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. You see the fantasy here? Here's this Persian king or this Median king who's so impressed that he tells everybody in the whole world, worship the God of Israel alone and nobody else. If only it had happened that way, right? So you get this sense of these idiot kings who see the light, and then again, the very next chapter, the next king comes along. No memory, right? No memory at all of what's happened here. Let's talk about the fiery furnace in chapter 3. This is not about Daniel, but about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just get some of the details here. King Nebuchadnezzar, this is the king of Babylon, made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. So about 30 meters tall, about 3 meters wide, probably some kind of an obelisk or something like that. Makes it out of gold because why not? He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justice, the magistrates. You hear the folklorish aspect of this, right? And all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. What a great day at work, right? What do we have to do? Oh, I got to go see the statue unveiling and kiss up to Nebuchadnezzar. So, who comes? The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Over and over again, that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, right? You see his vanity maybe in this. When they were standing before the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." What a way to run a kingdom, right? Therefore, as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. See, it's funny. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans, another word for Babylonians, came forward and denounced the Jews. So here we get now the palace intrigue. They send to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears," right, "the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon," I'm going to skip that, "shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods. They do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, of course, no self-control, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up?" He's a builder. Now, if you are ready, sorry, Brent, you're a builder too, kind of. Anyway, that I have set up. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you should fall down and worship the statue. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? And there's the point. They answer the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let that God deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." So interesting here, right? They don't know what's going to happen necessarily, and they say, even if God doesn't save us, it still doesn't matter. As we talked earlier about martyrdom, right? As a reality, here are three men who are boldly standing up for their faith, knowing very well what it might cost them, knowing very well that God might not deliver them. Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary. I mean, again, the hyperbole in all of these stories. And he ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the furnace of blazing fire. So even the people who carry them are killed. They're in there. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished, rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Weren't there 3 men we threw into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." That's always the answer if you're in one of these courts. He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Some Christian interpreters say, well, that's Jesus, which I think is a little stretching, but it could just be God. We sometimes have been taught, well, God doesn't have a body in the Old Testament. I'm not so sure that's right. Ezekiel might have cast some doubt on that. Moses sees God's backside in the book of Exodus. In any case, they're joined in the fire by somebody else. Nebuchadnezzar approached and says, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." They come out, all the satraps, prefects, governors, we're going to skip that part. They gathered. They saw the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not scorched, and not even the smell of fire came from them. So Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree," this is what Nebuchadnezzar is good at, "any people or nation or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Right? He's only got one tool, and that's violence, which he's good at using. So again, the comedy in a lot of these stories mixed with the utter seriousness of the threat. Why I keep calling these folk tales, we have no evidence that Babylon ever converts or that Babylon ever changes. And indeed, these same kings, or at least their sons or their successors in each chapter, have very little memory of what's come before. They don't stop worshiping who they worship. So it does appear to be a collection of folk tales that have been gathered together, which makes us have to ask the question, well, who gets encouraged by stories like that? What's the value of stories like that? And that's, well, why do we tell folk tales? Why do we sometimes gravitate toward miracle stories in the Bible when times are tough, or Jesus' healing stories in some seasons of our life are more powerful than perhaps some of Jesus' teachings, right? There are ways in which these stories seek to build faith, and they also seek to prepare people for the worst of possible outcomes. There's more. I mentioned that Daniel has visions in the last 6 chapters of the book. And maybe the most notable of these is the first one, where Daniel sees four beasts. Margaret and I were marveling at this earlier. The descriptions of the beasts are grotesque and strange, and so it's always fun to find illustrations that say, well, I'm just going to paint it as literally then as possible, and we'll see what comes of it. But you'll see a winged lion, you'll see something with four heads, you'll see something that nobody quite knows what it's supposed to look like. Anyway, this is what Daniel sees. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. You think you have a hard time sleeping. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and four beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. A lot of scholars think this is probably talking about the Babylonians. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. Some people think this is perhaps the Medes, this kingdom that followed the Babylonians. After this, I watched another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So 4 heads can look all 4 directions of the compass at once. Some have equated this to the Persians. After this, I saw in the visions by night a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. Perhaps here's the Seleucids, right? This beast just destroys things. That's what it does, right? It's fierce. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it. It had 10 horns. People think these are the 10 different rulers of the Seleucids up to this point. I, Daniel, was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one that came up among them. 3 of the original horns were plucked up from before it. Antiochus had to defeat 3 rivals to take up the kingship. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. What in the world does that look like? Right? You've got a horn on a beast with human eyes and a mouth, and the mouth is just speaking out arrogance. Kind of wonder what that sounds like. If you've ever heard politicians speak arrogantly, I guess you could fill that in. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. Probably an image of God here. And what is God going to do now? We're going to see an image of judgment. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. This massive court. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. There's an image you've heard, right, around judgment. The books were opened. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. I love this. The horn doesn't shut up, even in the presence of God here. As I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So the worst judgment here on the Seleucids, and perhaps Antiochus in particular. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Who is that? Well, Christians, right, would say, well, this is Jesus. In fact, that line, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. When Jesus is on trial before the Jewish authorities, they say some variation of, well, are you the Messiah? And he says, well, I am. Or he says, you say that I am. And you'll see me coming on the clouds of heaven. There's a quotation from Daniel chapter 7 in the Gospels. As well, that expression, I saw one like a human being. In Aramaic, the actual literal translation of that is, I saw one like a son of man. And Margaret mentioned son of man last week around Ezekiel. It just means human being. It just means mortal. So in the context of Daniel's vision, what he's saying is, I see all these beasts. I saw this ancient one on the throne, all of this fire. And then this human being, somebody who actually looked normal, comes along and receives dominion and power. And that name Son of Man becomes then, of course, a title for Christ. Jews, of course, read this differently. They don't necessarily see this having to be Jesus, but in a lot of Christian interpretation, starting in the New Testament itself, this becomes a kind of prophecy of Jesus as one who receives a kingdom not of his own, right, but a kingdom granted to him by God. So there's a lot going on in Daniel, isn't there? In terms of what's going on here. So notice the grotesque, in these visions. Again, notice the violence and the arrogance and the sense of conflict that's woven through so much of this book, and this kind of dual strategy, two different ways of trying to speak comfort to people. One through these these stories you might tell around the campfire, right, to get the kids excited or get the kids to go to bed or whatever. Just these rousing stories of faithfulness that's rewarded. But also then stories of a God who is watching during a time in which it might feel like God has abandoned us, right? And the powers of this world and their violence is harassing us to no end. Just when it feels like God is either not powerful enough or that God doesn't care, you get these visions of a God who promises one day judgment will come. One day I will deliver you. And in Daniel chapter 12, there's this lovely image of resurrection that says one day people will be raised to either punishment or to reward. I'm going to leave that alone because Thea Portier-Young on her video has just some lovely reflections on Daniel chapter 12. And I have one more slide, but Karen has a question. Maybe we could run the microphone to Karen, and then that will lead nicely into our final slide, unless the question's really hard.
I don't think I'm capable of a hard question. So I find it intriguing that you said that, we as Christians, we right away think of Jesus, but Jews don't think that. So help us think differently. So what do other people or peoples think about what this might reflect?
This one
That
like
little-
a human being.
Yeah, right.
And I would say some Christians think this too. I think that this is, it could be an angel. Daniel's a book that introduces angels to us. We learn the names of some angels in Daniel, who we also see in the New Testament. So this could be some kind of angelic figure whose job is to kind of implement God's will on earth. It could be a vision of a new king. It could be a vision of a Messiah. It could be a Jewish understanding of this will be a ruler. Jews would then say, we still believe in a coming Messiah, we just don't think it's Jesus. From a Christian perspective, this could be a foreshadowing of Jesus himself. I think I would want to kind of draw a middle ground. Obviously, authors of the New Testament drew connections between this figure and Jesus. Not necessarily to say that the author of Daniel somehow envisioned a Jesus who preaches a kingdom, but what Daniel is envisioning is a different kind of authority being handed over. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel says God is the one who sets up kingdoms. God is the one who installs rulers and deposes rulers. It's a real kind of God-intensive view of history in which everybody, recently this was, what's his name? Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, was asked if he thought God appointed Joe Biden as president. And he said, yes, I have to believe that because I believe that God appoints rulers. He was alluding to Romans 13 and to Daniel chapter 2 when he said that. It's a really strict understanding what Daniel 2 has to say. But it's this understanding that even however Antiochus got on the throne, God still has a vision of a different ruler who's going to rule with God-given authority. So it is this sense of evil's real, evil's awful, but it won't last forever. One day God will deliver us from this. Does that help? Kind of muddy the waters. It's at the end of the day, it's a symbolic vision. Now, does it fit the way Jesus talks about himself and his kingdom and the way in which we talk about resurrection and the ascension and things like that? Absolutely. But that's part of the way in which the New Testament authors are looking to the Older Testament to give them the language and the imagery and the footing, so to speak, to think about how do we talk meaningfully about Jesus, not as a shift to a new religion, but as somehow being consistent with everything the Older Testament bears witness to. It's a good question. Thank you. Last thing then, how should Daniel influence what we should expect from theology? Maybe a different way of putting the question. Daniel reminds us that humor, satire, and criticism might have a place in theology. Imagine that. Sarcasm is one of my spiritual gifts, so this makes me feel good. And this is a lot of humor has to do with power, right? In terms of what kinds of literature empower certain people in certain places in certain time. Sometimes all you can do is laugh at the devil. Sometimes all you can do is make fun of the tyrant. Sometimes you get made fun of for good reason. The cabaret's coming up. They're going to roast Margaret. Yeah. Not me, however. None of the youth know who I am. So, encouragement. We've seen a lot of judgment. We've seen a lot of warning. We've seen a lot of saber rattling from God in some other books. Here's a place where the theological message is encouragement. And the message is perseverance is worth the risk, to quote Thea Portier-Young. There's language of incentive and reward. We see some of this in Jesus, right? When it's time to pray, go pray in secret, and your heavenly Father who sees you in secret will reward you. I mean, there's language we like to say that, well, you don't earn your way into heaven, and that's true, but Jesus incentivizes the message from time to time, as do other authors in the Bible. Daniel, I think, leads us to expect that theology should involve unmasking the world. In other words, part of theology is to name human arrogance, human resistance, human sin for what it is. One of the reasons I like being Presbyterian, I like having a confession of sin at the beginning of a worship service and recognizing that we commit sins of our own volition and our own brokenness. We also are part of systems that implicate us in all sorts of ways. How does theology tell the truth about the world? And what does it mean to perceive the hidden work of God, which is something Daniel and others seem to be able to do? I choose these because these are not just Daniel types of themes. These are also Christian themes, I think, in many ways, and Jewish themes, because there they are in the Older Testament. But these are also things that I see in the Newer Testament as well. I see in Jesus, and I see in the way we talk about who God is and what does it mean to be a follower of God. So my concluding question then is, do any of these resonate with you? I mean, when we talk about what does it mean to think theologically, that doesn't mean, can you recite the Nicene Creed for us or the Apostles' Creed for us? What that means more so is, what does it mean to view the world through a lens that understands God is present and God cares and God might be at work in hidden ways? So that's the question.